Okay, this is Basis 137. We're with Bob Osborne. We're part two, and we're going into the detail now. So, Bob, welcome.
Hello, Miles. Good to be here.
And it's very good to see you, and this information is so incredibly important. It's unbelievable, but you've got some pictures to show us.
I have.
So let's go on with what you're talking about and get into the detail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. The first picture. As a writer and an artist most of my life, it's kind of relevant to look how I came about to do the work that I've done and how I've gathered information. So we're going to look a bit at both my father's and my mother's side. So starting with my mother's side, this picture on the right, that's my great uncle, George the Giant Auger. In 1900, he was Queen Victoria's bodyguard. He was also the second tallest man in the world. He was also known as the Cardiff Giant. So in 1904, he was in the Barnum and Bailey Circus in London, and I think Barnum was there, and he realised that my great uncle was taller than his own giant, so he got him up on the stage and sacked his own giant and took my uncle off to New York to be in the freak shows across America.
Actually, I've only just realised there's a man there with 3 legs.
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, keep the photo. So that's George the Giant Auger, my uncle. The man on the left is Harold Lloyd, who anyone who knows about silent movies, he's along with Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, you know, one of the stars of the silent movie business. So when my uncle embarked on the boat, he got picked up to go on the freak shows across America with a collection of dwarfs who were called the Horvath dwarfs. They were a Hungarian family of dwarfs. And the little lady in front of him, that's Miss Pee-wee. She was a midget. Harold Lloyd on the left wanted to use my uncle in one of his films as a giant, and he was signed up by Hal Roach to be in this movie. The guy on the right is Francesco Lentini, and he had the distinction of having 3 legs and 2 penises. So this is the kind of people my great uncle was working with. There's some documenting material of him going across the freak shows. This is post The Elephant Man, so it was still very much a part of that vaudeville act. He then got picked up to go on stage in Jack and the Beanstalk, and he was on the stage for about 10-15 years. When he got signed up to be in the movies with Harold Lloyd, they were about to start shooting, and he had a heart attack and had to be winched out of his hotel window. But prior to that, he'd made a living having his photograph taken with a lot of the rich families around Connecticut. So I've got lots of photographs of him with, with families standing next to him, because he was, I think, 8'4". There was only one man that was taller than him, and that was the Russian giant. And I've got a photograph of both of those together. But with normal people, as you can see, it's quite freaky. And I was interviewed by the BBC Wales about this, who wanted to kind of tell the story. Because it's my family, I kind of hold the archive of it. So I've got lots of photographs of him with the succession of dwarves in the circuses, with Charlie Chaplin, with Sidney Fairbanks Jr., no, senior that is. And also I've got his ring here, which I think I showed you the other day. This is the ring that he had in 1920.
Yeah, but the thing about that is that it could fit me.
Well, maybe
almost.
Maybe your Nephilim as well, Miles. But that's his ring.
Yeah.
And that is my finger. So, you know, he was clearly a freak, and how it came about with the BBC is that they wanted to do a programme, but because of the stuff with midgets and dwarves and freak shows, I think they thought in the current work climate they couldn't really pursue it.
I mean, what sort of work climate was that?
Woke.
Woke.
Yeah. So, you know, also the problem I had was that I wanted to write a book about him being my uncle, great uncle, but all the images are owned by the Getty Foundation. So when I asked them about that, I mean, the cost of me using those images was astronomical, despite the fact that it's a member of my family, which, you know, is a bit annoying.
Well, I think there was a problem about that was when a monkey took a picture of a monkey. The monkey owned the copyright.
Yeah. Can you go back on the
Yeah.
the picture? So effectively, he made a living being photographed as a freak all around Connecticut and in New York, and he died in 1920. And my grandmother, who he was her older brother, we had no TV in those days, obviously. And when I was growing up, all they knew that her brother was a policeman and had been private bodyguard to Queen Victoria, and she actually named him Captain Auger because he was her favourite bodyguard. So he wasn't actually officially a captain, but people can Google his name and they will get a better view a lot of these images online, and they're incredible photographs of that time. With him, with the collection of dwarves, with all kinds of freaks like Francesco Lentini and obviously Lloyd. So that is the other thing is that when I was interviewed by the BBC, they said, well, they assumed it was just a case of giganticism. So I did mention that it could have been Nephilim throwback, Nephilim bloodline throwback, which does happen. And clearly there's a lot of people who've done investigative work on the fact that there were a lot of giants around back in the day. And when they said he was the second tallest man in the world, well, I think I've seen photographs of giant skeletons and things that the Smithsonian Institute normally put away somewhere. So even going back to Cornwall with the work I've done, with my Xena book, Xena Spirit of Place, one of the theories about these giant stones and boulders that are scattered all over the moors is that the fabled giant got angry and just used to throw them around. So the folklore mythology about giants is something that does go back to Nephilim with regards to the fallen angels and marrying human women. On the left, Rebel Not Taken is my art brand, and there's a very interesting story behind that, which relates to my father's side. In 1685, my ancestor Alexander Osborne took part in a Monmouth rebellion, which was an attempt to overthrow the monarchy. So they were going to, overturn James II. Effectively, he was just a mercenary in an army that was raised by the Duke of Monmouth. So they were going to march on Bristol, and they got all these guys from various villages in Somerset, one of which was Merriott, where my family at that time were living, having moved up from Zeno in the Middle Ages. So they went against Winston Churchill's troops. They got slaughtered because they were called the Pitchfork Army. So they were ill-equipped, but basically they were just disaffected peasants who were used by the Duke of Monmouth in order to, have his attempt to overthrow the monarchy and install himself on the throne. He was a playboy, and they got slaughtered by Winston Churchill's peasants, by Winston Churchill's army. The ones that escaped, including my ancestor Alexander Osborne, were branded by Judge Jeffreys, the hanging judge, as Rebel Not Taken. So this was in the assizes. All the ones that were captured, I think there was several hundred that were captured. They were hung, drawn and quartered, and their entrails were put on trees all the way up to London to discourage other peasants from revolting. And effectively this was the Battle of Sedgemoor, which was probably the last battle on British soil. Other guys in that rebellion were Daniel Defoe, who was the famous writer, who was pardoned, I think, because he was a gentleman. Another guy was Dr. Peter Blood, who tended the rebels' troops. He was actually caught and sent to the Caribbean as a slave. At that time, some of my ancestors were sent as slaves to the Caribbean, and it was common for peasants to be sent as slaves before they were sent to Australia, to rich people's estates, also white, in the Caribbean. So, but I know full well that I've got descendants who have got my surname in the Caribbean who are actually, black now. But Peter Blood went rogue. He escaped his servitude and became a pirate, and he became Captain Peter Blood, or Captain Blood, Pirates of the Caribbean, which is good. So I've always had a thing about pirates and mermaids. Going forward, I adopted Rebel Not Taken as my art brand, and you can see I've got it tattooed on my arm. So effectively, we were branded in the assizes by Judge Jeffreys, and I adopted it as my art brand because it explains to me why I've constantly had a problem with authority, why I think they've got it in for me, that they've always tried to suppress anything I do, and I thought having it as an art brand was kind of some kind of revenge. So I've now got a publishing company, and all the books that I've written are kind of based on it was an element of defiance and rebellion, and trying to keep free from the control system, the grid, the prison that a lot of people are in, whether they be peasants or not, were generally ne'er-do-wells. This is my grandfather on the left. He was Edward or Teddy. He had 18 children, of which my father's one. He was in the war at the Somme, and I grew up with him and his wife, and as my grandparents in the 50s, and he always wore his medals. And he said that his happiest time was on the Somme, because he legitimately had a rifle, and he had definitely tended to be a psychopath. So when I subsequently went to university in the 1970s and had a history lecturer called Corelli Barnett, who was very much not pushing the official narrative, I explained about my grandfathers actually enjoying the war. And he said, to be honest, most of the people that were from London or from Glasgow or Liverpool, the conditions on the Somme in the trenches weren't that much different from what they experienced at home. So it's not such a leap of faith. He was a bare knuckle boxer, and if we go back to the photo, that's him in the middle there, and these are 11 of his sons. He actually had 18 children with my grandmother Nellie, who was a Romany gypsy. 17 boys and 1 girl. 6 of the boys perished either in drowning or in child diseases, but 11 of his sons survived to old age, and I think there's 10 of them here. None of them could read or write, and my grandfather couldn't read or write. Nellie, the Romany gypsy, she not only brought up all these children, but she had to deliver the coal, and during the Spanish Civil War, she took in children from the Spanish Civil War, and all my uncles resented the Spanish because they had to share beds with all these Spanish children. So they were pretty itinerant, although they did have a junk shop in Clarendon Road, and they were rag and bone men. So when I grew up, we were out on horses and carts all the time, and my grandfather, we had stables in Latimer Road, and it was in the early 60s that Gorton and Simpson were coming sniffing around, and I think my grandfather and the other guys, the other totters are what you call rag and bone men. So the other totters in these stables formed the basis of Steptoe and Son, which I'm sure people will know was a comedy series about a rag and bone man in the 1960s, of which I'm quite proud. If we go back to the photo, that photo was taken on my Nellie's burial day. She died in 1964, and I had a very close relationship with both my grandmothers because my mother and father weren't really equipped to be parents. So Nellie was a psychic, and apart from doing all the tea leaves and things like that, she told me that she'd passed on the gift to me because I was blonde at that time, and all of the others were pretty much dark. And if she'd passed on the gift to me, what we call the gift, I would use it for good and not bad, and I'd use it for good reasons, and the others would use it for criminal reasons, because several of them, it was a bit of a crime family. If we go along one more, the guy on the left is my uncle. That's Spike Osborne, and he was the closest to my brother. He did 21 years in Brixton. He was his main crime was stealing the Lord Mayor's chain and then melting it down and making sovereigns and things like that. So he was the one that got put away the most. But my father wasn't so much a petty criminal, but they were all involved with various activities. And Leslie, or Spike, was actually pulled for the Great Train Robbery because he was friends with Buster Edwards, who sold flowers at Battersea. Buster Edwards was one of the members of the Great Train Robbery. Years later, there's been many synchronicities regarding all of these activities, and I then befriended a guy called Nick Reynolds, who is one of the band members of Alabama 3. His father was Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind behind the Great Train Robbery, and also they called him the Gentleman Thief. So there's various theories about the Great Train Robbery. It was partly set up by the Secret Services, and they were tipped off in order to detract from what was going on at the time with Christine Keeler and John Profumo. So where we were living in Notting Hill Gate, a couple of my uncles were working for Peter Rachman. I don't know if anyone knows about Peter Rachman, but he was a Polish slum landlord who also ran prostitutes, and he used to just like buy up properties that were tenanted or had sitting tenants and literally throw them out windows. And he would bring in West Indian families and create a lot of unrest in order to get hold of these properties. He was also running prostitutes, and my father was living with a prostitute called Rose. So I was kind of in that world all through the early 60s. My uncle, Gypsy George, had a monkey, which was called Wanker, because it used to just... It was bought off a ship, but those days you could bring animals in. We had a monkey and a parrot. So basically we grew up in pubs, and it was a very interesting time in the 60s because we were transitioning from the Spivs and the Teddy Boys and the post-war generation into, the counterculture scene. And my father was always hanging around with a lot of actors, and we kind of mingled quite a lot with the aristocracy as well because money would come and go. My father used to play cards, and they had psychic ability as well. He could count cards even though he couldn't read or write. When I was 11, and when I was 8, I'd been living partly with my mother and partly with my father. My mother was like only 17 when she had me, so I lived partly in this world with gypsies and criminals, and then my mother tried to escape from that world, so she moved in with her parents into White City, which was quite a rough area. So my grandfather, my mother's father, was in the war, and the Second World War, and he was on the Russian submarines, so he had like mental problems from being on the Russian submarines. He was also a boxer, so both my grandfathers were boxers. When I was 11, when I was 8, the school I went to, which was just a humble little school, identified me as having gifts. So when I was 8, 9 and 10, I was presented to the Lord Mayor, and I won a prize for the top boy in this school. There's a photograph of a prize I got 3 years running. I got these awards, and then what was strange that when I was 7 I could play chess. For 3 years I was presented with these books, one of which was 62, 63, 64 were the years. Usual stuff, about the empire and boys' own stories. On my last year of this primary school, before I sat my 11 plus, I had the complete works of Shakespeare, and it's a bit ironic because only 6 years ago my girlfriend at the time was Shakespeare artist in residence at the Shakespeare Trust, and I had 6 months hanging around Stratford-on-Avon, looking for interesting things to find out. And there were a lot of coach tours coming, Chinese tourists. So I was doing my own art project, which was an alternative look at Shakespeare. And I started talking to these tourists, and it turns out that there's a whole Stratford-on-Avon in a city underground in China, where rich people can go to the actual one. Rich people come over to Europe to see the real Stratford, but all the locals can go to this underground place where they've done an exact replica of Anne Hathaway's cottage, Shakespeare's birthplace. When I started digging around, I realised that Anne Hathaway's cottage, which is a big money spinner, was actually built way after Shakespeare, was supposedly there. And I came to the conclusion, having chatted with other academics, that Shakespeare obviously didn't write those plays. They were written by Francis Bacon, who was an absolute genius, and possibly the Earl of Oxford. And the level of occult knowledge in these books, regarding Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, a lot of the mythology of the Knights Templars. I mean, clearly there's no way that a working class boy from Stratford. So I pretty much realised that this was all a fabrication, like pretty much everything else we've been told. So I was questioning things even then. The fact that I could play chess was really weird because my father couldn't read or write. There was no one in my family that could read or write. They spent all their time gambling, drinking, running prostitutes, and so I was brought up in a very kind of streetwise world. So from an early age, I could count down from a dartboard quite quickly. We learnt to take our monkey down the pub and give it a pint of Mackerson, and then the locals would come in and say, "Can I buy a drink for the monkey?" So my uncles would then stack them up behind the bar so that we would drink all night free. And eventually we had to get rid of the monkey because the landlady was complaining about the noise. So we took it on our horse and cart and released it into Holland Park, back into the wild. So playing chess was really weird. My dad used to take me to the pub, and I played chess against people who've been playing for a long time, and they said, "Where do you learn to play chess?" And I had no idea. But at that same time, I had a lot of psychic activity, regression back to past lives. You know, I'd been regressing as a child back to living in Venice. That subsequently came to pass much later when that was confirmed by someone I married who also had the same experience of me and her being in Venice. So when they realised I could play chess and that they could throw numbers at me in the classroom and I could come out with the answer, normally multiplication, so they'd toss a load of numbers at me and then the number would come into my head. I later learnt to realise from Robert Graves, who was a very important person in my life, who I'll talk about in a bit, that this is what they called analeptic thought or analeptic process. So when I was getting all these awards from the mayor, I was selected or told that I was going to this, had a scholarship to this special school, which was at that time a grammar school. And so we did the 11 plus, and clearly I had achieved very high results in the 11 plus. The 11 plus at that time was in the early 60s, was run by the very much part of the Fabian Society, who part of the eugenics program. The LSE, the London School of Economics, which is an agent for British intelligence and for propaganda and indoctrination of its students into a Fabian, let's say Luciferian agenda as well. We're administering these 11 pluses all through the London County Council. So I was picked out to go to this school, and it was a Freemasonry school called St Clement Danes. It had a main office in a main church in London, and our governor was Douglas Bader, who was the guy who had tin legs during the Second World War, was blown up, a great military hero. He was our governor. So every year we'd come out and he'd give us this speech about how we were the 0.01% of the population. We were born with God's gift, which was to be an Englishman. So he'd come on the stage with his tin legs and go down again. And then outside the church, there's a statue of Bomber Harris. So it was very much run on military lines. So a lot of the lessons were, predominantly about both world wars, and all our teachers were ex-RAF Battle of Britain pilots. Which is great because they all wore flying jackets, and they tended to be not your traditional teachers. But one of the other benefits or curses of it was that physical activity was very highly prized, and so every morning we would go running around Wormwood Scrubs, which is a desolate place in that area of Shepherd's Bush next to Wormwood Prison. So we'd have to run around Wormwood Scrubs, which is in a t-shirt and in the coldest of weather. And one of the things that caused me problems when I went for the interview, my mother told me not to say that my father was an antique dealer and that he was away on business in order to get this scholarship, because they saw it as a way out for me to get out of this background, with the gypsies and the crime and all that, and to get a proper education and to become elevated into the system that would enable me to escape, because all my other cousins were in and out of jail. They were drug dealers or they were prostitutes. So I had to tell them that my father was away on business, and clearly if he'd been there they wouldn't have let me in the school, because he just was too far down that road of being a gypsy and swearing and etc. And so when it came to pass that I got into the school, I was put through all these tests continually, and about a year or so later, both my mother's parents, who I was living with at that time because it was near the school, committed suicide by sticking their head in the gas oven. I mean, that was the way out for poor people at that stage. So I came home from school, my granny, whose uncle was George the Giant Augur. So there was a lot of mental let's say, there's been lots of mental illness in my family. My great grandmother was in an asylum for 30 years. So my auntie also, and George the Giant was clearly a bit odd, to say the least. So she stuck her head in the gas oven. Then a couple of weeks later, my grandfather stuck his head in the gas oven. So because it was the winter of '64, which was a really cold winter, they wouldn't bury him because the undertakers were on strike. And it had been a suicide anyway. And so effectively they buried my grandmother. So we had him upstairs in the room for 6 months, which was quite difficult. My mother, who was also psychic, had a nervous breakdown, went to live in Spain. I went to live with my father. So when I went to live with my father, it was further from this school run on military lines. So I had to come in every day, and because we didn't have any baths or anything like that, often I was dirty. So I was always getting punished for like having dirty hands and not having my tie done up. We had to wear this uniform. And once I came in, and he gave me a lift on the horse and cart, because we had a horse and cart. That's how we got around West London, Island Park, Totting. And I was seen by one of the masters getting off this horse and cart. He dropped me in the road, and I walked into school. And then it was obviously announced that my father was a gypsy. We were rag and bone men. And then this all got all around the school. And I think that a lot of the teachers or the headmasters gave me the impression that we'd cheated our way into getting this scholarship, and that other deserving boys would have probably been better suited. So my problems with authority were like really set in stone. And when we were doing this cross-country race, I was getting systematically beaten for things that I didn't think were really valid. Every day we did the cross-country race, as long as you weren't in last, you didn't get beaten. So the boy that came in last, was always a fat boy, and he always used to get beaten. And the options we had for beatings were cane. So the headmaster had 6 canes in his office, lined up from top to bottom, depending on the severity of your crime. You got beaten, but they would normally beat you with bare hands as well on your bare bottom. So I always made sure that I was like third or fourth from last, because we used to stop to get a drink in the cafe that was next to Wormwood Scrubs. So when it came to sports day, I thought, I'll really try hard now, and I'll try and get in with the teachers. So I came second because I was quite a good runner. And the only boy that beat me was the London champion. So my form teacher said, go and report to the headmaster. So I thought, I'm going to get congratulated. So what he did, he said, bend over and I'm going to cane you. And I said, why? He said, well, because every week you come near the end and clearly you're deceiving us. And today you've come second. And so I got beaten. So again, my problems with authority were always reinforced at this school, and it was actually quite a hellhole. So I was living with my father at the time. Then when my mother came back from Spain, I went back to live with my mother because my father's cohorts were all in and out of prison. And my father was also, we were living with a prostitute who he was involved with. So I went back to live with my mother. But prior to that, she'd left me with her best friend called Domini, who was also a prostitute, but she was a roly-poly, so she would do posh men, judges normally, and bondage, and she was a dominatrix. So I lived with her for a year, and she had 6 children by 6 different men. She's also the mistress or the lover of Ken Dodd. So I'm in and out of this world, living between 2 separate households, both extremely dysfunctional, at the same time trying to keep myself together at this grammar school that was run on military lines. So there was occasions when I was taken to the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme and things like this, and we were like sent to farms and stuff. I don't know that there was ever any particular project that I was in. I know that there was projects at the time because after the war, people like William Sargent and the Fabians took a particular interest in children, and especially they were interested in children from dysfunctional backgrounds who had experienced a lot of trauma, and also they were interested in psychics. So a lot of the tests they were doing on me was to ascertain my psychic abilities. So I wasn't aware of this until much later when I spoke to a lot of other people about this, and there was lots of kids my age who were also put into programs where they were measured every 7 or 8 years. They were constantly they've always taken a keen interest in bloodlines, the whatever you want to call them, the Cabal, the Illuminati, the Fabians. They're fascinated by your bloodlines, and clearly having having a Romani Gypsy background with a history of a psychic experience. The thing about gypsies is that they have second sight. So second sight has been a thing that has gone all through my life. So I enjoyed this for about 5 or 6 years. The beatings, the psychological abuse, the bullying. That I was quite resilient, having come from where I did. And when it came to 1970, I decided I'd had enough of this. So I went to the Isle of Wight Pop Festival, which was kind of a bit of a seminal thing because that explains a lot of future work that I did with regards to examining and decoding the counterculture and the drug use of drugs by various agendas. I took my first LSD tab at the Isle of Wight Festival, given out by girls that were passing them out, and I realised then this was all part of a program that was run by the by the Huxleys and the sergeants of this world. Grew my hair long, looked like Jesus, went back to school, and headmaster said either go and get your short back and sides in the morning or don't come back to school. So I made the decision not to go back to school, told my mother, and she was very upset because they saw it as an opportunity for me to move out, escape from the world that we were in, which, as far as I'm concerned, was quite an interesting world. I mean, I don't really think I had that much of an unhappy childhood until I was put into the system, So that's when the problems came. So I got a job on a building site. I was about to do my A-levels, and I was about to go into A-level study. So I got a job on a building site to support myself, and to placate my mother's worries, I enrolled in night college to go to do my A-levels at night college in 1 year, and this was just a polytechnic. Because my lifestyle had moved on, so I was more involved with drinking and girlfriends and still gambling on the horses and a bit of drugs and things like that. I didn't really ever go to college. I just worked on a building site. And about 2 weeks before the exam dates, I suddenly went into a panic because I was laying on the floor and I realised that I got a letter saying this is your exam dates. So I hadn't read any books, I hadn't gone to any classes, and I was able to try and find a solution to this. And what I now realise was the analeptic process, was that I laid on the floor, and then the only solution I could come to was that I needed to know what the exam questions would be. And so the exam questions presented themselves to me. I then spent a week answering these questions, not by necessarily going and reading the books or studying, because there wasn't time. I just somehow was able to download information into my head, and I suddenly got the answers to all these questions, one of which was Hamlet's soliloquies. So I prepared the answers to these questions mentally, and I didn't even have them written down, but I knew that I could access them. So when the exam came, I had to go to this hall, and all those questions came up. It was English literature and politics were the two subjects which subsequently, of course, have been following and very interested in since. So I got all A grades, and for some reason then I got a letter saying, you can apply for university. I went back to my school, saw my headmaster, asked him for a list of all the grades that they got, and of course he didn't want to see me, and I said, look, I've got all A's, so what you said about me, is completely, unfair, and to be, I said, you've given me quite a lot of motivation that I know how corrupt the system is. So then when I went back to the college, they said, how did you get all A's? I said, I don't know. She said, you didn't come to any classes, we never saw you, this is the first time I've seen you. And they said, you need to go to Oxford and Cambridge for an interview. So I said, I don't want to go to Oxford and Cambridge. I wanted to go to University of East Anglia to study creative writing, because at that time that was the best venue for that. So clearly they wanted to get me back into the system, and when I said I don't want to go to Oxford and Cambridge, they were shocked, but I knew that I shouldn't go there. So going forward, I always wondered how I could do these things, how I could play chess, how I could go back in time, travel in time through past lives. Then I got always involved with people, normally girlfriends, who we'd had similar experiences in that we were past lives together. And I think our mutual friend Andrea Folks has done some interesting research into the fact that entities, past life. And I'm not necessarily an adherent to that philosophy, but I do know that DNA, which is something I've looked at, is crucial. And when I was writing the book on Zen, A Spirit of Place, I looked into DNA and realised that DNA takes 15 generations to degrade. So the DNA that we have, so the DNA I had, it was only 7 generations ago that my ancestor Alexander Osborne took part in the Monmouth Rebellion, was hunted down, had to go into hiding for 2 months, for 2 years actually, until he was pardoned, was branded as rebel not taken. So that kind of explained to me why my DNA was so strong and powerful that I could not, I always had a problem with authority, and I always had the sensation that they were hunting me down, and that they were trying to take me down. So it borders on paranoia. So the DNA is crucial. And when I was researching, 2 significant literary figures in my life, I'm pretty much self-educated, what's called an iconoclast. So despite the fact that I had 3 years at university, most of my education, my philosophies and my belief system, my knowledge comes through what I then later found out was the analytic process, which means that you don't absorb information on a linear scale. You can tap into to knowledge, and of course, going forward, Lawrence's belief was that the DNA of ritual, to do with the granite where I live, which is has a very strong spirit of place, is crucial. So my DNA is all my ancestors' DNA. So I'm the first person to read or write. So I always considered that I'm at the tip of this spear, and that I have to make up for all those downtrodden peasants who had rubbish lives. So when I went to UEA again, I was really looking forward to it. And at my first interview, there was a couple of Marxist lecturers who were quite well known, quite famous, who I think one of them is dead now. But in any case, I turned up in my donkey jacket with a lot of attitude, with the roll up, and I walked in, and the guy, I think Sage his name was, he was one of the brilliant counterculture lecturers. But at this university, there was also Ian McEwan, Rose Tremaine, Ishiguro, 3 of the most eminent writers of the last 20, 30 years. So the creative writing department was very, very brilliant. My tutors were Angus Wilson and Malcolm Bradbury, two well-known writers who I got on really well with. They were quite free thinkers and bohemians. But when I walked into this interview, he said to me, "Oh, great, you're exactly the kind of student we want here." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, we are promoting we are Marxist. We are promoting a Marxist agenda. We believe in challenging the system, overthrowing the system. There's lots of demonstrations. You can go to all the demonstrations." And suddenly the instinct within me is say, "Hang on a minute, why are you trying to rope me into your agenda? I'm not your token working class poster boy." So then I had the instinct that which I know now, is that these agendas are all fake, and it's all a Fabian controlled agenda. So Marxism is that part of that Hegelian dialectic where they entrap the working class into what they believe to be like a counter revolution, which is all controlled. So being naturally defiant, I immediately refused to go on to any demonstrations. I was hanging out with all the rich people. My best friend was the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm. So I have always got on well with rich aristocrats. I don't feel as though in any way that don't need to doff my cap to anybody, because the thing about being a Romany gypsy is that you actually think you're God's children. So, there's a certain arrogance that goes with the fact that your bloodline is Romany, and it's a very strong feeling. So you kowtow to nobody, and you don't look up to anybody, and similarly, you don't look down to anybody. So I was hanging out in the south of France, going to the casinos. All my girlfriends I had a propensity for rich girls, aristocrats. So, that first winter I was with the daughter of the Bishop of Rye. And so I went completely the other way. I started wearing corduroy trousers, smoking a pipe, wearing a cloth cap, And then, people were saying, oh, but, other socialists who weren't really socialists, they were champagne socialists, and some of them became good friends of mine. But I said, look, you don't know what socialism is about. I said, you're being manipulated. So I said, I'm going to have the best time I want. This is my life, and I do what I like. And and my choice is to live like a millionaire. And money always manifested to me later in life. I've never actually worked for anybody because I have the gift. And one of my mantras that every time I sign a book, I write "be lucky" on it. And again, this goes back to the gypsy stuff, because one of my uncles used to have a suit with all holes in it. So every morning during Epsom, he'd go down to the races, and his wife would sell lavender, as they used to do. And of course, people were terrified of the gypsies, because if you don't buy lavender, you get bad luck, which is like ill-wished. So the witchcraft that I've experienced and researched around Zen oil in particular, there's an element of this in the sense that you should never cross a gypsy. And so I always write "be lucky," and even people who are skeptical about the whole thing, that I believe you can manifest luck if you're doing it with good intentions. I say you don't have to have "be lucky," and they go, "Oh yeah, put it." Also I did it with the book. I published an edition of 666 copies, which a lot of people thought was very sinister, and I said, well, look, I dance with the devil, so I believe that I've got protection and I have good luck, and therefore I challenge all the malevolent spirits and the witches that have made effigies of me and married me, and and that I've hung around with, and MI5 operatives and MI6 agents. I kind of moved in and out of that world quite easily without ever getting inducted into it, although the Freemasons have on several occasions tried to draw me into their web, one of which resulted in my abandoning my successful business as a wine taster, and then going off grid again. But we've jumped forward. So in the 70s, I dropped out of the system altogether. I do this from time to time. I just disappear. I went to live in a cave in Crete. This is me living in this cave in Crete, and it's probably the best summer I've ever had. I was like just getting octopus from the sea, and quite reclusive, and incredibly healthy. I've always, one of the benefits of going to the school that I did was that although we were like, they indoctrinated us with all the neo-colonial bullshit, was that they did place quite high emphasis on physical health, and I realise that's another part of the Fabian agenda. It taps into creating a healthy race. So despite the fact that I rebelled against it when I was at school, when I actually went to university and was leading more of a dissolute life, I always went back to my base survival technique of training. So I would train in gyms, and I can modify I can reset my metabolism even now through diet, through fasting, through drinking my own urine, rather than through the hallucinogenic route, which is another route to awareness where you can download information. So I spent literally 3 months living like a savage in the Greek islands, but it had its benefits because, again, people come into my life all the time. At that time, I then hooked up with a Swedish model who was very beautiful. So apart from living in my cave, I would go to spend weekends with her in a hotel in this village in Matala in southern Crete. I mean, the Greek islands are very close to my heart, and I spent 3 years literally just bumming around the Greek islands, writing poetry and living the life. And so I'd go to stay in a hotel, and which was great. And then it was very bohemian, but then I'm used to that world. So, I then had a relationship with her mother as well, both at the same time, which I thought was brilliant. And I had a friend came out to visit me, and he said, well, what's going on? You're sleeping with a mother and a daughter. That's kinky. I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's not kinky. It was an opportunity that presented, and it was very interesting. And then the daughter wanted to have a child with me, and she knew that I was sleeping with her mother, but it was all kind of accepted because they were part of this very liberal intelligentsia, and the mother's husband was a top psychiatrist at Gothenburg University. So, I went briefly to Gothenburg, and then I found out that Charlie, the daughter, was was taking her temperature all the time and stuff like this, and was told me that she was attempting to get pregnant. Well, this has been a recurring theme in my life, pregnancies. Even last year, I've now got a child from a liaison I had last year in Zeno with an Eastern European lady, a girl, very beautiful again, who told me she was in the Illuminati, and that we performed a Crowleyite sex ritual on the Menantol, a fertility ritual, and now, of course, I've got a child, which, guess what the name is? It's Zeno. So last year I wrote a book called Zeno, Spirit of Place. I made a documentary called Zeno, Spirit of Place. I've got Zeno tattooed on my arm, and I've now got a child, less than a year old, called Zeno. But that's pretty much how my life has been. Nothing surprising there. On this photo, at this time, I was living what's called a pantheistic life, which means that I was a complete hedonist, and I would do exactly what I wanted, without any control. So I was sleeping rough. I slept rough for about a year. I got deported from Switzerland and Luxembourg for being a vagrant. Luxembourg was particularly handy because I was sleeping in the forest and I actually had £100 in my pocket. And these kind of little youth scouts came along and started beating me up and put me in jail and said that I was being done for vagrancy. And I said, look, it's my choice to sleep in the forest. So in Switzerland, I walked the whole length of Switzerland over the course of a few weeks, went to Zurich, and I got done for going into the cafes by the stations in Switzerland because the trains are so efficient. I worked out with my brain that I inherited from my father, because he was running a lot of scams, that you could sit and have your meal, your steak and chips, your glass of red wine, and time it to the second, and then you jump on the train. So after I'd done my walking tour, I was jumping on the trains from Bern to Zurich and Bâle and Geneva, testing this system out. And eventually I got caught, so they deported me from Switzerland. Then I was writing poetry, and I'm not really getting very far with it. So I decided to get a legitimate job. So I went to Spain and got a job in Murcia, which is southern Spain. That's where they filmed all the spaghetti westerns. It's kind of, this was in the mid-70s, so it was not long after Franco had died. In fact, I lived in Barcelona in 72 when Franco was still alive. I actually liked it. I preferred it when there was a totalitarian regime. Like when I was in Yugoslavia, I preferred it when you go in cafes and there's pictures of Tito on the wall. And in Barcelona at that time, which is a beautiful city, I liked the electricity that was in the air and the fact that the Guardia Civil were there. There were certain codes that you could practice, like opening a packet of cigarettes from the bottom rather than the top. That it was quite a subversive activity. So I went to Murcia and I had this job, and I'd never really had any job other than manual labour. So I had to teach these classes, and I found it quite onerous. And I thought, I don't want to do this. I'd signed up a contract to work for a year, and middle of the night I just woke up in bed. I'd had a bottle of red wine. I woke up and think, I'm fucking off. And then I thought, where shall I go? I just said, I just want to escape. So that thing in Crete is that I've done this quite often. I escape the matrix, I escape the system. The minute the control grid moves in, I need to get away. I did it when we had the lockdown 4 years ago. I had a big house in London. I couldn't bear the thought of being under house arrest and being tracked and traced, so I moved down to Zeno to live in this remote farm, which is where I live now. So this has been a leitmotif all through my life, is that I need to keep away from the whatever you want to call it, the matrix. Now I now realise that most of these agendas are very Fabian, with a Fabian doctrine, and a lot of it's to do with mind, entrapment of your mind and control of your mind and your body. So middle of the night, I think I'm going to go to Mallorca. I'm going to go and visit Robert Graves. Now, I'd known a little bit about Robert Graves from reading Goodbye to All That and studying First World War poetry, because having gone to this school, my main interest was both wars. The World War I and World War II. I've done a lot of. I'm fascinated by both of them, and that's partly because all of our lessons without the rest of my education was completely neglected. I couldn't speak a word of French. So basically we studied history, we studied English, and we studied physical activities. So, you know, it was like being in a boot camp. So it did ingrain you with a certain discipline, but getting beaten so regularly, you know, and I think the fact that I was at that time traumatized by the death of both my grandmothers, my grandfather, and also living between my father and my mother, both of whom, my mother was like, she's now in an asylum, and my father was just the most chaotic, free living person who ever imagined. And there's a photograph of him being arrested by the military police there somewhere.
Okay.
So this was after the war, Second World War. My father, who I was living with for quite a lot of the time, and I think one of the reasons I became a writer, you know, I put it really down to the DNA on my father's side, and there's more insanity on my mother's side. So clearly, this very eccentric childhood has given me a sense of reality that doesn't really conform to the official narrative that we're put into. So I've always been questioning the narrative. And is my father being arrested? And during the war, my grandfather was in the war, in the First World War. He was always beating his sons up, and he tried to enlist in the Second World War when he was 52, I think he was, but they wouldn't have him, A, because he was too old, and B, because they realised he was a psychopath. So none of his sons really went to the war. My father, all his uncles. One of my uncles was running a black market around Notting Hill Gate, robbing warehouses, and it's quite ingenious really, because what he'd do, he'd rob warehouses and then he'd distribute goods and leave them on the doorsteps of widows and wives whose husbands were fighting the war. So things like that, you know, these kind of low level cons, I always found them very interesting. And you know, let's say I've skirted the law quite a lot, but always tried to keep within legal boundaries. So I know how the system works. I know how banking works. I know how property works. I know how risk reward works. Simply because of the DNA that I've been blessed with, and my grandmother gave me the gift of second sight, which, as long as I don't abuse it massively against real people or humans, you know, is going to keep me in good stead. So the fact that my father was arrested by the military and then put in the glass house, which is where they used to put people who absconded. The day he got put into national service, of course, he absconded, just like I absconded from my military school. And then when I started to study more and study DNA, study genetics and bloodlines and things like that, I realised that I really had no choice in the decisions I make. So it's quite easy to work out why Rebel Not Taken is my art brand, why all the projects I've done eventually get me in trouble with the authorities, why mainstream academia never validates or even wants my work. I always had to go work underground, set up my own publishing company, you know, publish limited edition books. You know, I've also dabbled in porn art and taboo art because coming from where I do, I've probably got Tourette's. So, you know, my love of swearing, I find it quite one of my releases. And so I have to be careful. Having said that, I've been in a lot of polite societies, and I've people who are generally highly educated don't worry about things like that. They don't worry about what knife and fork you eat with and things like that. So I'm quite okay with the aristocracy, and I've had the opportunities to hang out with people like Princess Margaret, you know, Jeremy Thorpe. You know, I got connections with the Trumps, connections with the Maxwell family, including a weird connection with Ghislaine, which I'm not going to go into. So I've moved in and out of all these worlds quite freely, and so I put it to my DNA, which is what I call wild DNA. So with what's been going on recently, which again I won't really go into because there's members of my family that have been in let's put it that way. They've worked for Bill Gates and Imperial College and stuff like that, and stuff that's went on in Peking. So I've always been interested in espionage as well, because I've grown up where deception is a skill. And even, I'm going a bit off tee here, but even as a neighbour in Zennor where I live, again, the levels of synchronicity involving artist connections to occult societies and espionage, I mean, it's absolutely rife. One of my neighbours, John Le Carre, great writer, MI5, MI6. He's not who we think he is. You know, his father worked for the Cray twins, and it was a con man, you know, crook. And I also realised that with the experiments that were done, the IQ tests that were separating me from the rest of the herd and the peasants, that were going to go into you know, boring jobs and then be killed at 60 when their time was spent, or fed junk food or fed lies. You know, they do select children from the likes of me from these various backgrounds because I think you've got something extra, and I always felt I had something extra over the upper class twits and the kiddie fiddlers and you know, the inbred cretins that went to public school and now populate, you know, banks and secret service agencies. So it's no surprise to me that Le Carre's father was worked with the Crays, because my family had connections with crime. That's all I'll say. In fact, one interesting thing is that people ask me if I was born in Cornwall. I was very nearly born in Cornwall. I was one day away from being born in Cornwall, because in 1953, my father, my grandfather, and all his brothers were drinking in a pub called the Kensington Park Hotel in Abbot Grove, and one of their buddies was a guy called John Christie. I'm sure everyone knows about Christie, 10 Millington Place. Superb film with Dickie Attenborough, the guy, ex-auxiliary policeman, Freemason, no doubt, which is why he was protected. And they found all these bodies that were hid behind his living room and his garden. He used to get prostitutes and people who wanted to have abortions and gas them in his chair because he was a part-time doctor. And then he hid all the bodies. Well, anyway, in 1953, he was on the run. He used to drink with my family. My dad's side anyway. My grandfather on my mother's side wouldn't have anything to do with him. He was on the run. At that time, my father was also on the run with my mother, who was pregnant with me. So she was like 9 months pregnant. They hitchhiked down to Cornwall, which I subsequently did many times. You know, maybe that's in my DNA too. He was holed up in a pub. And at the time, all over the papers was Christie on the run. So there's photographs of Christie on the sense that they'd known it was him. There was a man search out for him. So my dad was in a pub and they said to him, because he couldn't read or write, he didn't know this was all over the papers. So someone said to him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Notting Hill Gate." He said, "I've had to disappear from London for a while, so I've come down to Cornwall." Of course, they gassed him up and he got pulled in because they thought he was Christie because of the Notting Hill Gate connection. Anyway, he said, well, he told him he knows Christie, which is just weird, you know. Anyway, they realised it wasn't him, so they let him off. So they said, "But you've got to get out of Cornwall. You know, you're not welcome here." Well, the book I've just written is about how D.H. Lawrence was hounded out of Cornwall for various sexual deviancy and espionage activities, and how Crowley was also, you know, expelled by the Vicar of Zennor, and I always thought that, you know, this was also in my DNA. So they hitchhiked up to London, spent a time with my uncle Gypsy George. I was born next day in London, so like I was one day away from being born in Cornwall. That's just a weird story, but there's loads of others. Right, Robert Graves. This is important. I left Murcia. I got on a ferry from Barcelona, which I'd known because I'd lived there before in 1972. Got on the ferry to Mallorca, got off the ferry, decided to go to the village Daya because I'd seen an article in the newspaper about Robert Graves and how he was killed in the First World War, but came back to life, and that he was a very eccentric and bohemian poet who everyone thought had magical properties. So he was a bit of a magus, and he was a massive counterculture figure, and probably, along with Lawrence, the two most important literary and maybe philosophical figures that have informed my work, and also my personal life as well, because I've had personal relationships in certainly in the sense with Graves, and probably psychic relationships with Lawrence that have enabled me to do the work I've done with both those people. So I got off this bus. There's a cafe there called Jaime's Cafe, and Robert Graves was sitting there with a sombrero with his wife, who turned out to be Beryl, and a couple of other people. And so I walked up to him thinking, shall I announce on the fact that I'm very pleased to meet you, and I've come to hang out in this village for a while. You know, I didn't know how long I was going to stay. And he said, well, come in, we've been waiting for you. So this has happened to me before. You know, like the university, people were waiting for me. So I sat down, and next day I found myself invited to tea in this fabulous house there, with you know, the orange groves, and in this village called Daya. Now there's two places that I have an intense spiritual connection with, and one of those is obviously Zena, and it has the same feel in that every time I've been there, magical things happen, people come and go. It's like stepping into an alternative universe, and everyone that comes to visit me on where I live now in Zena, which is like the old farm where the commune was, I mean, it literally is a piece of paradise. I mean, people can't believe, you know, the magical powers that emanate from the granite, from the ocean, from the earth. And Daya is very much like that. The minute I set foot in Daya, this is my first ever experience of realising that the spirit of place and the DNA of that place affected me both mentally and physically. So next day I'm at tea with Robert Graves, and I'm thinking, this is just another weird experience, but you know, weird experiences are what I do. And then he started, Beryl, his wife, who was absolutely lovely, said, don't be alarmed, but Robert wants to sit next to you because he thinks you're interesting, and don't be surprised if he starts talking in strange language. So I said, okay, that's great. So I sat next to him, and actually he's probably the only person I feel as though I'm in the presence of an absolute genius and someone who's not of this world. So make of that what you will. But he then regressed me to the First World War. I said, what's going on, Beryl? And she said, he was killed in the Somme. His obituary was in the Times. He came back to life. It's a good story. It was in Goodbye to All That, this great novel written in 1929 about quitting England, escaping to Daya, like I've escaped to Zenor. And of course the atrocities in the First World War tipped him over the edge into an altered state, just as Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence, had abandoned the hell that was. He wasn't even at the war, he was in London, but he just had the vision of hell, so he went to Zenor to form a utopian community. So the two villages of Daya, which is near Valdemoso in Mallorca, and Zenor, which is near St Ives in Cornwall, both have this intense moon presence, as I subsequently found out. When the moon's there, I mean, I've never seen a moon like it. And also there's things that emanate, spirits that come out of the rocks, the sea, the atmosphere. And a lot of people that went there at that time were getting trapped into hallucinogenic drugs, because Graves, as I'll explain in a minute, was really at the centre of how hallucinogenic drugs can be used for mind control and brainwashing. So he regressed me to the First World War, and I was apparently an Irish guy in the trenches with him. I found the whole experience incredible. I then wanted to stay a bit longer, and so I did stay indefinitely. And I was hanging out with Robert Graves, and another occasion I was at tea, and one of the Huxleys were there, one of the members of the Huxley, because Graves was from this world, even though he was otherworldly. He was from the Oxford set. He was his grandfather was a famous German physicist called Baron von Ranke. He'd married into the Nicholson family, who, ironically, Ben Nicholson was one of the major figures of St Ives. Subsequently, I was, had contact with his family. So I wanted to know more. So I was literally gathering any information or any psychic almost not like in a vampiric sense, feeding off Graves's energy. And he was one of these people at that time. He was in his 80s, and there's rumours that he was going senile. But as far as I'm concerned, he did have the ability to transfer mind files from one creative artist to another. So I got very interested in his work, and all through my life, I've had lots of experiences that what's called the analeptic process. I'll explain what that is. Graves wrote The White Goddess, which is an exploration of pagan myth, and at the time he went completely against literary narrative and scholarly research. He was a professor at Oxford. I think he was going to be made, the Queen's poet, if not. But he was give these lectures. And basically, he was an occultist and someone who moved around in different time zones and scales. And when I spoke to him about how he wrote the Greek myths, because I lived in the Greek islands, for 3 or 4 years, I was very interested in Greece. It was I'd had time travel experience in Greece when I'd go into a Greek island and I'd immediately go back into time. And all through my childhood, I could go back to Venice. I could play chess, probably because somebody else who was inhabiting my physical body was a great chess player, or because in a previous incarnation I'd been a chess player, or I just had one of those minds that was a DNA freak formula, like my giant George the Giant Augur, who was from a family of peasants, dozens and dozens of them, and they were all quite short. So, and then suddenly he's a giant. So, I think it's something to do with bloodline, something to do with DNA, something to do with throwbacks. So when I realised he'd written the Greek myths in 3 weeks, I mean, this is a scholarly, and I found out how he did it, in that he had what's called, it's a form of remote viewing, but I don't like to use that term, because I think what it is, and what I did with when I got I clairvoyantly saw the exam papers questions, and I look at it more from a different point of view, that it's second sight, which I've got gifted with, and I've been gifted with it through my DNA and through my grandmother. So I've always had second sight. I'm a big sports fan. As a kid, I was obsessed with football. I trained, I had trial at QPR, and I've got QPR tattooed on my fingers. I would go to bed at night time, dream the score next day, and it would always be that score. So little things like that. Graves time travelled, and it's a form of poetic intuition. I mean, I did try to read Tim Rifat's book, what's it called? Remote Viewing, and I looked at the work of Yuri Andropov, but for me it's just a scientific method that I can't get my head around, because I don't think along linear lines. I mean, I can't work a computer. Everything I touch that's involved with technology goes wrong. I fuse things, so I have to come information and knowledge from a different point of view. And then I latterly realised, and first of all intuitively, that I had the gift that Graves had, and that either he'd given me more energy that my gift would come out somehow. But I've always been eternally grateful to Graves, and he's probably philosophically the most important influence on me as a thinker. So eventually I felt like everyone else, that I was going mad simply by being in this world where you're in a world that isn't the same world that we live in. So it's almost like the real world, but what we're living in is a construct. So I went back to Norfolk, profoundly influenced by Graves's thought, and the fact that we'd had some transference of knowledge between us, and that as an older man and me as a younger boy, he'd passed on a gift to me. But other people had similar experiences, so he definitely had Magus qualities, and I think the establishment thought he was a charlatan, because they couldn't work out how he wrote the Greek myths and he wrote The White Goddess in a matter of weeks. And of course they just said it's automatic writing. Lots of people have dabbled in automatic writing, including Aleister Crowley. So Aleister Crowley will come through knowledge, by summoning, by opening portals, through rituals like sex magic rituals, or opening portals that access Lam, which was the avatar for the Greys species, which he did in 1904. I can go into that when we talk about Crowley. So I went back to Norfolk completely full of confidence about this experience, and then I thought, I'm just going to write poetry now, because I've been writing poetry. And so I sat down, and within a couple of weeks, I wrote a selection of poems called A Moon in Leo, which was about the Battle of the Trees, which was the psychic warfare between trees. And it harks back to a lot of ancient paganism and Druid myth, of which Zeno is very much part of that world. So all the work I've done early on with poetry and with Graves, I realised then that this was coming through me, and I had no control, because I didn't even research, I didn't even read Graves's books, but somehow I then latterly came to realise that mind files can be transferred between people. And I've often done it. I've worked with a lot of female artists, a lot of great artists. We've done collaborations, and I've also had relationships with them. And even me noticing, my sense of DNA, it works reciprocally as well. So it's not like a vampiric or a parasitic thing, that when I've had working relationships as an artist or writer with different women, normally through sex and things like that, that's one of my channels. Being having grown up in a very physical world, that's one of the channels that I can access information. So I've also done it through extreme physical activity, like walking across Switzerland, like sleep deprivation, fasting. I go on various fasts. I've studied nutrition and diets, and I drink my own urine now and again when I want to reset my metabolism. I got into that through Sarah Miles, the actress. If you remember that, Ryan's daughter, very beautiful woman. She was a neighbour of mine in Chiswick. She bought one of my paintings. I was in the jacuzzi with her in my health club when I was training, and she started about drinking her own urine and how she went on the Johnny Carson show. And I said, "Oh, I'm really interested in this. Can you tell me more?" So I also fancied her rotten, and so I sold her a painting, and then I was trying to hang out with her, and she told me about it. And then I said, "Well, I would drink your urine," jokingly. I didn't actually drink her urine, but I've subsequently had relationships or friendships or interactions with basic people who practice various forms of occultism, witchcraft or sex magic, and I have drunk girlfriend's urine. So I kind of go in all these places where most people won't go, simply because I've got a very inquisitive mind, and I always try to find an alternative to the official narrative. And when I find things that work for me, I know that I can control my illness, despite years and years of abuse, really, drinking, womanizing, all the usual gypsy vices. I've got a mechanism for controlling it and reverting back to resetting my metabolism, and mentally and psychically, that's a form of poetic intuition. And when I subsequently was researching for my book on Zeno, I took another deep look into Robert Graves, and also found out about the associations he had with the Fabian world, and which led on to stuff to do with MK Ultra. And a lot of nefarious agendas that he was innocently, used as a vehicle for, as was D.H. Lawrence and most of the artists that think they're making revolutionary gestures and living a free life, and in fact they're all often trapped in a control grid where their talents are used for purposes that they don't want them to be used for.
Well, what makes Zener? Do you think Zener was attracting? There was something in Zener which was attracting those people to there.
Yeah.
There was another force involved.
Yes, I mean totally. I mean that's one of the tenets of my book. There's forces within Zeno, as there were in Dea, that Lawrence was aware of, and just like I was aware as a young writer that there were forces in Dea that I managed to tap into. Lawrence also tapped into those forces in Zeno, and once those forces are released, you can look at all the theosophical arguments for raising Kundalini. Summoning prana. In Crowley's case, it would be summoning entities and summoning demons. So Crowley was also very much in this action and channel information, but he came upon it from a completely different method to Robert Graves, and to the people that would then use like remote viewing, like the Montauk experiment, which I know quite a lot about. And at that time, I'll get on to Graves' connection with brainwashing. His method, the analeptic method, is that you step outside of time and you move backward of time in order to gain information, and it can be quite random, and that you have to be under the control of what he would call goddess worship or muse worship. So he would always have muses. Robert Graves always needed a muse, i.e. a mistress or a sexual partner or someone he was romantically in love with in order to bring himself out as a poet. So his was a poetic intuition way of accessing past information that is otherwise not available to most people. And the basis of all occultism or esoteric knowledge is that this is esoteric knowledge. It's not exoteric knowledge which is available to all. So all those people like Lawrence, Robert Graves, Aleister Crowley had access to this knowledge, either through secret societies, through their sexual rituals, physical rituals, or the fact that it was just passed down to them because they were from the right families, and it was inbred in their DNA. So Zenor is a latter day, when I went to Zenor, it was like all over again there. So I immediately was time traveling. There's rooms in Zenor in my house, which is enormous. I could go into different rooms and have different sleep experiences. So if I'm researching something, I could go into that room and I could time travel or get information from various files. And if I had certain girlfriends, I knew that I could tap into their information. So one of my brands, apart from Rebel Not Taken, is Mad in England there, which is a very talented girlfriend I had for several years who was a baroness from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So her brand was Mad in England. So we did a mushroom trip in Amsterdam, and then we did a lot of mushroom work, and then we decided to merge our brands, and then we found out that as artists, very different artists, our arts combined, just as we combined physically and sexually, and so her work became more like mine, and my work became more like hers. So for 3 years we were highly successful. And then of course I always push everything to the edge. So I started doing taboo art and porn art, and my work's been kicked out of porn shows, that was supposedly, extreme taboo art. So, the whole Saatchi thing was another big agenda that I got caught into a web of working for people like that. But Graves's method intrigued me, and then I subsequently, it was a piece of the jigsaw that would always confuse me, because again, I met his granddaughter Georgina, who walked into my life randomly in a shop, and I said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm Spanish." I said, "Are you from York?" She said, "Yeah." It was Georgina Graves, Robert's granddaughter. I've been on buses and I've got chatting to a woman. One woman was called Judy Simons. She was one of Graves's muses. So I've met Graves's muses randomly, and then had connections with them, years after Graves had died. I've gone back to live in Graves's house because Graves was involved with Sufism, and the guy that took over his house was, as far as I'm concerned, was a charlatan. But anyway, I lived in this house, and I was there with my best friend, who was the grandson of the Kaiser. He was translating Nostradamus from medieval French. I was there writing at the time. We both saw the same ghost, and it was the ghost that Robert Graves had seen in 1926 when he first lived in this house at the old bakery. I didn't know anything about this at the time. I confronted the owner of the. He said, "Oh yeah, that's the ghost there." So constantly, whenever Graves comes up, I've had all these analectic psychic experiences to do with my interaction with him. So I wrote my poetry in a matter of weeks. It was very successful. It was accepted into a lot of poetry magazines. And then when I did that, I could never write poetry again because I was out of that timeline. I couldn't get back into that timeline. I couldn't get back into it until I went to live in Zenor. Anyway, recently I thought I need to have another look at Graves, because when I approached my research onto Lawrence, I'm thinking there's a missing part of the story here, and I think I can access it, and I can access it because I'm living in the house that he lived in. My vegetable patch is where he grew his vegetables. That's where he had the vision of the snake that he then wrote his poem The Snake. It's where he wrote Women in Love, which was always my favourite novel. Women in Love was written at Tregethen, as I go into in the book. What it was really about was a lot of Fabian agendas, including sex ritual, worship of Baphomet. But I've had people who've written books and they've got doctorates on Lawrence, and they've come to visit me because they want to be where Lawrence was. And I tell them all this, and they think I'm absolutely nuts, because they can't have the same process of gathering information that I have. So, okay, I'll wrap this up with Graves. In 1954, he was in Deir. He was visited by a guy called William Sargent, who also lived in Daya. Daya is one of those places that it's always been lived in by eminent people or extremely talented people. Like even my experience of living in Daya on and off over the last 30 years, like Roman Polanski's been there, Bob Geldof has been there, my godson went out with Peaches Geldof, they had a house there. One of Robert Graves' best friends was Spike Milligan. Various rock stars have had houses there. Richard Branson bought the old hotel that I used to hang out in and converted it to the residential. So it's always been one of those kind of little places, a bit like Zeno, that it's a private place for the elites. You know, nobody can afford to live there really. It's just tiny, and it's a secret place with secret knowledge. William Sargent, who was high up in the British Psychological Association, that was partly to do with a guy called Kenneth Milner. Now I'm trying to access this information because I haven't written anything down. He was doing experiments that led on to Tavistock and MK Ultra. One of the guys he was working with was Dr. Ewan Duncan Cameron. Now Cameron was one of the people in the 50s when I was growing up, and I explained the tests that were done on people like me and all the other children, the working class children, which they just see as guinea pigs for their testing. And I subsequently found out a lot about other people involved who I've also known in life who were involved in these various agendas. He was put in sleep deprivation. He'd have sleep rooms where they'd analyse sleep patterns, and they would put, strap you into mechanical heads, just like they were doing at the same time in Montauk with the Montauk boys.
Well, Duncan Cameron in that.
Yeah, well, that's the same Duncan Cameron.
Same Duncan?
Same Duncan Cameron. So, when I say about these jigsaws and when I say how I gather information, so then suddenly I've got the missing link. So Robert Graves was an expert on many things, and one of the expertise that he had was medieval communal rituals in Mexico. Now, he only had that experience because he'd never been to Mexico, but he could time travel to Mexico, and he could time travel back in time. So when he time traveled back to the Greece of I Claudius, he wrote I Claudius, which became a very brilliant TV program. It's about how Claudius poisoned people with magic mushrooms. So people knew, people in that world, the Fabian world, that Graves was the go-to man for all this knowledge about psilocybins, I think they're called. He knew all the drugs in Mexico that were being used in rituals. They had no idea how he got that information, but they did know that he was absolutely brilliant, and he had it. And of course, he just said that he got this information by time travel and by psychic going back in time and focusing as an artist. And once you're in the awe of the muse, you're serving the muse, and you've got a muse that you can use to channel this information. That was his method of getting it. So I've used similar methods of getting information, either by deprivation because I've experienced trauma. So I can, although I'm fragmented, I can use that trauma to part of my mind can go to another place that isn't inhabited now. So William Sargent decided to use Robert Graves's, tap into Graves's mind. Who's to say that he didn't upload or download the mind files that Graves was able to pass on? He asked Robert Graves to ghostwrite a book called Battle for the Mind in 1954. And in that book, which Graves regretted writing because it got passed over to the CIA, and it was one of the Bibles for MK Ultra mind control programming that the Huxleys set up. So Robert Graves, in a way, was an innocent magician. He would give his information freely to people, and Sargent took this information. He wrote Battle for the Mind, which became the Bible of brainwashing, and it's only people like me who know that Robert Graves ghost wrote that because I've had access to Graves' letters and things like that. So he sold this information on to a guy. William Sargent was working in the British form of the Tavistock Institute, doing psychological research among them on a lot of children. This is a few years before my childhood, or people like Casbolt, who were probably in what I think he would call Project Oak Tree. But there was all these programs running along concurrently, hundreds and hundreds of them on children. I know people now my age who've been in programs all their lives, and they don't even know. They have to be tested all the time, for illness and things like that. So another guy was Jolyon Elks. Okay, it's coming to me. Dr. Jolyon Elks. He had an office in Washington. He was in the CIA. he was a friend of Alan Dulles, the Dulles twins, which you know all about. Dulles, yeah, the Dulles twins. I mean,
Germans?
they were not,
Nazis?
they were Nazis. Yeah, I mean, they were very important. And they were important in bringing all these Nazis over to Project Paperclip. Dulles. Well, anyway, this guy Jolyon Elks was an intermediary between the English Fabian establishment, who were doing our own experiments on children. You know, I'm not saying that I was in any particular program, but I was aware that we were monitored. He also set up Aston Hall in Birmingham. I think he was affiliated to Birmingham University. He set up Aston Hall. They were doing similar tests, and Cameron was flipping between the Tavistock Institute and Washington, where they do experiments. You know, where they put children with their headphones on, and because at Montauk, when they were doing these experiments, and well, you probably know about this. There's a megabyte of 425 at Montauk with the invisible radar technology they got. It's the same megabyte as the human brain. So it's about merging you with, it's the early form of merging you with the machine, and it's all part of a eugenics program that the Fabians have kept hidden from a lot of people. Jolyon Elks passed on the information. No, Cameron also was running McGill University. That's right. He was running McGill University, and that was where, in my theory, that he got people like Leonard Cohen, and Leonard Cohen was at McGill University later. Leonard Cohen was under MK Ultra mind control and used for various agendas, along with a lot of other rock stars. All those children went missing in McGill University in the grounds, and I think the mothers, called the mothers of formed a society where they dug up all these graves. Anyway, clearly Cameron was I think his name was Dr. White. I think he had that was his nickname. He was involved with all these like quite sinister programs. He took Robert Graves's knowledge of mushrooms and how mushrooms can be used along with LSD. Now, Robert Graves also did a lot of experiments on LSD because they paid for him to do experiments in New York on LSD. And because Robert Graves had the kind of mind that he could access information that they couldn't, because they were scientists, and Graves was a poet, you know, as far as I'm concerned, a brilliant poet. He told them that the mushrooms was the flesh of God, and that you could get a real shamanic experience from mushrooms, but you couldn't get the same experience from LSD because it was a synthetic version of this
Very
shamanic,
important
mechanism. So
Important.
already we're into the synthetic world where they create a synthetic drug that is again part of the Luciferian agenda. So the information that Robert Graves wrote in Battle of the Mind and gave all about was passed on to a guy called Robert Gordon Wasson, who was a collaborator of Cameron. Now Cameron partly set up the MK Ultra mind control program, and Robert Gordon Wasson was a CIA operative. He was also worked for JP Morgan Bank, and he was the medium or the agent for passing all of Graves' information through Cameron to the CIA. And of course, who was involved with that but Aldous Huxley. And Huxley was very thick with the Graves. The Huxley family were part of Graves' milieu, just like they were part of D.H. Lawrence's milieu. And also I've tracked down how Huxley used a lot of Lawrence's information, because Lawrence could tap into information from the earth. This is the thing about him. He was like me. He was an outsider. He was a working class. The establishment never accepted him. They hated him. They used him. You know, they killed him in the end. But he could access information from the earth because he was the son of a coal miner. So they was aware that Lawrence had these talents. Graves had these talents. So all of Graves's research, which was basically a form of magic, was passed on to the CIA by Robert Gordon Wasson, and Graves was like paid a few quid, and then he said he didn't want any part of it, so they kept his name out of it. This information was passed on to Huxley, and it formed part of the experiments that they were doing. I think the American system of experiments was far more advanced than what we were doing here. What we were doing here was still based on the mass observation group, one of whom was a guy called Julian Trevelyan, who was an artist, a surrealist artist, who I knew and played chess with. He was innocently, you know, documenting working class life in Bolton in the early 50s. And well, I'm currently in dispute with a photographer who photographed my ancestors as well, my family in Notting Hill Gate. So about using photographs of my family, but anyway, I'm not going to go into that. Aldous Huxley then was very prominent in setting up the counterculture movement, which informed the use of hallucinogenic drugs. So a lot of this information that Graves gave to Huxley was passed on to Timothy Leary. Now, Timothy Leary, The Doors of Perception, which was, I think, written in 1957, there was massive research at this stage, and that was pretty much based on Graves's research passed on by William Sargent. So he absorbed all this information into the Tavistock Institute. And now Huxley's Doors of Perception was taken from a book called by William Blake, the fabulous mystic and occultist from the 18th century, who Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So the occult links, the literary links, are very wide and very deep. And unless you go into this world and you educate yourself with the stuff that goes back to Francis Bacon, back to John Dee, Edward Kelly, through Crowley, through Lawrence, through Graves, through Huxley, you're only going to get like the scientific narrative, and you're not going to get the poetic narrative, which is the analeptic process about how this information is discovered and passed on and used by the establishment. So the whole MK Ultra here in London in the 50s, when I was growing up, it was very much a provincial scene, and I think the Tavistock relocated and suddenly upped the ante and went to do all this high level research in McGill University and other places, but it was still run by the Fabians. It's still run by the Fabian agenda. So the idea that the New World Order or mind control, or whatever you want to call it, MK Ultra, CIA, super soldiers, all that stuff, that this is some kind of American agenda is completely fake, because it's just the end result of a century of Fabian agendas and Fabian intelligence and doctrines that have been carefully worked out through Darwin, through H.G. Wells, through Huxley. So all of these things that happen, all this close encounters, all the alien stuff, that's all been worked out through people like Bulwer Lytton. They've articulated it, and Orwell and Huxley have set the program. They've set the Bibles. They've set the textbook for what went on. So America was clearly a much bigger, more powerful country, and so the CIA, which was working very closely. I think the CIA was actually set up by MI5, and Huxley was a far more significant figure in the CIA than people realise.
Shrimpton is saying that it was set up by the DVD.
Well, yeah.
We're going into the central,
the
1850s.
I know the theories.
Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah, I know the theories about the DVD and MI5, and I have a slightly different take on it, in the sense that it's one big occult group. Now, the DVD, which drew a lot of its philosophical beliefs from Bavarian Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, the likes of Blavatsky, the likes of the Knights Templars. The York Rites became New York. Scottish Rites was involved, in fact, comes from Bavaria. So all these Freemasonry groups that followed the Knights Templars, which was taken over by the Illuminati in 1776. The Bavarian branch was pretty much so I see them all as one. I just see the war as an occult war between these various warring factions who've also got, they're all in the same, they all have the same globalist mindset, which is a Luciferian about, that we won't go into that now, but I think the DVD and the Abwehr and MI5 and MI6 and the KGB and Mossad, it's like one big club, one big group of chess players that are all competing against each other. So with regards to the wars, who's to say that the DVD took over, controlled our Heath and Hess came to try and get Edward VIII, because I think it's one big club, and I think it's one big game between them, and so I'm not sure that about this stuff. We are in the Fourth Reich. The war never ended. The Nazis were absorbed.
Casbolt is very definite that the Fourth Reich ended not too long ago, and that ended possibly 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, well, again,
maybe when Bush Senior.
Well, Bush Senior was Crowley's. Barbara Bush was Crowley's daughter, Aleister Crowley's daughter. When you talk about Reichs, there's another way of approaching this, and we're talking about eons. So we're going off topic here, but there's very good evidence that Barbara Bush, his mother, I can't remember her name now, Patricia, was in Paris at the same time Crowley was there. And there's a lot of people who've done research who I think very good research on the basis that Barbara Bush was Crowley's daughter. If you look at a picture of Crowley and you look at a picture of Barbara Bush, it's uncanny. Barbara Bush then married George Bush Sr., who's part of the, they were part of that Bavarian network of, the Nazi. The Nazi concept is something that goes way back beyond 1933 in National Socialism. This is go back centuries, and it's part of the occult groups that are linked to the Thule Society that have theological belief systems that are slightly different from the belief systems that the English aristocracy or the English occultist tend to be Zionists. So there's been ongoing war between Zionism and Nazism. And this is the Hegelian dialectic, in the sense that I'm not going to go into the Kalergi plan because that's very dangerous waters. But you look at the British Israelites and British Zionism, and the fact that we want Jerusalem to be possibly the next. Why are we singing Jerusalem? It's because all these nutters that run this country, have been running this country for centuries, believe that the second coming is going to happen here, either in Glastonbury or in the city of London. And they think this is the new Jerusalem. And coming from a poetic point of view, W.B. Yeats, who was a contemporary of Aleister Crowley, in fact, Crowley got him took over the Golden Dawn, and this was about disputes about theological secret societies and which one would be dominant. So Yeats wrote the Second Coming, a fantastic poem, by the way, and about the second coming of Christ, and that the rough beast that slouches toward Bethlehem. And it was this theology that informed the Lucis Trust, the League of Nations, the United Nations, NATO, United Nations, where we are now. So there's been an ongoing spiritual battle between Nazism and Zionism. And when you look at people like Hermann Hesse, who was at Ascona, books like Nazis and Goldmund, the whole Greek dialogue, Plato, Aristotle, Apollo, Dionysus, a lot of the philosophical thinking that informs these people, because the people that really are setting these agendas are highly educated and they have access to knowledge that we don't have. So I think they've set up a Hegelian dialect. Now, I can go into how the Nazis and Hitler was funded by J.P. Morgan, funded by the Rothschilds. You can't really use the J word or the Zionist word, because people confuse it with Hebrews, and then you get the Khazarian mafia, with the KM. There's a lot of information from people like Ben Fulford about that, and it's pretty sound stuff that the Khazarian mafia that were kicked out by the Russians, and who were masquerading as Hebrews, then took over the Frankfurt banking system via the Red Shields or the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. You look at the brilliant work of Dr. John Coleman, who was actually in the Bilderberg group. I was going to talk about this another time, but he's named all these Illuminati families, and it's pretty well documented. And there's definitely a dialectic set up. And we the British funded the Russian Revolution via Bolsheviks, and a lot of this was funded at LSE. They created Bolshevicism, which was an arm of Marxism, to set up a Hegelian dialectic so they can control both sides. And I think that exactly the same thing happened. Why did we fund Hitler? Hitler might have gone off script.
Well, he did, and they tried blowing him up.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's various interpretations of what happened. Clearly only 2 people were executed at the Nuremberg trials, which was a sham trial, by the way. One was Ribbentrop, who has a connection with where I am. And I've written a little chapter about Ribbentrop's activities down there. And then, of course, his aide went to work for Canaris. Now, there's rumours that Canaris was controlled by us. It's such a network, a web relation. I mean, I watched a little program last night because the people I'm staying with, they said, "Oh, it was a program about Ken Philby." So I said, "Oh, I watched that. I think I know about Philby because my father-in-law worked in Moscow, so very much part of that world." So then he had to go to Beirut when it all blew up with Philby and McLean and Burgess. So my friends were saying, "Oh, isn't it terrible? He was spying for the Russians." And but the thing about these agents and these spies, well, a lot of them were double agents. I mean, who knows? No one knows who Crowley was spying for. Everybody probably, but I had to say, look. Given what I know now, I can understand why the Cambridge spies spied for Russia, because we set up a fake Zionist agenda to destroy Russia, and those two wars. There's a massive Russophobia going on the British establishment and the American establishment. They're absolutely paranoid about Russia because of the occult beliefs that go back centuries to do with Russia, the Khazarian mafia. Khazar is now Ukraine. There's all the stuff about the deep state, Soros. That's all kicking off in real time. So the whole Hitler thing I find very confusing, and the fact that we funded him, but they funded him for other reasons, because the German Empire, they were getting all this technology, and there's a school of belief that think they were so far advanced technologically, and of course if you believe in the Thule Society and Aldebaran, and the fact that Maria Orsic, who was the medium or the channeler for the Vril, was also in Bavaria at that time, and the Thule Society gives a lot of the theosophical belief systems that Nazism adopted, but they're pretty similar to the belief systems that the Fabians or the British Zionists, if you want to look at that term, also believed. That comes back from Lytton, from Darwin. Now, Hitler banned Crowley, Crowley's work in Berlin. Not a lot of people know that Crowley was a very fine painter. He was hanging out with Huxley in Berlin for the 30s. Hitler and that party were terrified of Crowley because Crowley clearly tapped into other stuff, and like the workings he did, like the Babylon working, the Alamantra working, where he opened a portal in to Montauk, and I've gone completely off script here, but
Crowley,
Crowley opened a portal. Crowley was in.
Is that in Loch Ness?
No. Montauk is. Do you want to talk about Crowley? I mean, I've got.
We've been running an hour and 46 minutes.
I mean, we've gone completely
a short break
ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when I'm talking about it, if the information comes back to me, and if I don't necessarily remember it unless I can zone in on the information, because I haven't got it all written down. I haven't scrubbed it out. But we're going completely off script here. But the whole thing about Nazis, and agendas, and if you're a Crowleyite, which I'm not, but I've studied Crowley's philosophy, and it's incredible. It's incredible how predictive programming it was. So when George Bush, I try and be brief, Barbara Bush, I believe, was Crowley's daughter. Barbara Bush, it's all to do with Babylonian sex magic. So Babylon is America, going back to Egyptian. A lot of these philosophical belief systems go back to Egypt, ancient Egypt, like Osiris, Isis, Horus. In 1904, Crowley opened a portal in Cairo with his then girlfriend. Now, he had a succession of muses, just like Robert Graves had muses, just like I've had muses. His muse at that time was Rose Kelly, and he always operates through female mediums, because despite the fact that he thinks he's the reincarnation of Edward Kelly, and that Edward Kelly was digging up graves and shagging dead bodies, and Crowley's indulged in every vice known to man, he didn't have the ability to either, what you call it, remote view or channel information. So he would use females to channel information for him, which is why he had this whole sex thing with Baphomet, where you take possession of a woman through sex, you can access channels of information. Now, this is a whole belief system that Lawrence also went through, and the likes of Russell and also all the sodomites at Cambridge, perverted this, because that's why there's such homosexuality and even worse than that, paedophilia among the Fabian elites, which, I'm not going to go into that. So Crowley in 1918 was in Montauk. Montauk Island is an island, a place in Long Island off New York. Now, that was where the Montauk Project started after the war. So that was funded to the tunes of millions of pounds by MK Ultra, which was an offshoot of...
You're talking World War One or two?
Two, World War Two. Crowley in 1918 was in New York, and he's supposedly working for the German Secret Services. Now Crowley claimed Crowley worked for every secret service, and he probably did, because he was a magician who just practiced deception. He was skilled at deception. So he was in Montauk. In Montauk, he did a ritual called the I think it was called the Babylon Working. I think it was the Babylon Working. Prior to that, in 1984, he did a ritual in Cairo called the Alamantra Working. In Cairo, this will be of interest to you, with regards to UFOs. He opened a portal that accessed what he called Lam. Now, the character that he accessed that came through his ritual opening of portals, because he could open timelines, was Lam. And his drawing of Lam is more or less an exact representation of what we now know as Greys. So his drawing of Lam, or what he called Lam, which was the entity that he used to give him information from interdimensional Enochian magic, was what he used to tap into. And I think Refat and Colin Bloy know all about that. You could use various rituals to bring in Enochian magic, but if you don't know what you're doing, you can open a portal that then goes badly wrong. So he opened a portal that accessed Lam. Now Lam was also used by Lam equals Lama, which equals path in Tibetan, and Lam had a connection with a Tibetan entity that Edward Bulwer Lytton, who I talked about the other day, had accessed in 1827. So the Thula Society believed that this Lam was basically the ancestor of what we now know as Greys. And if you see a picture of Lam, it's exactly as they would use in the science fiction movies like Close Encounters. And when UFO abductees describe Greys, what they're describing is an image of Lam. So he opened a portal, and that portal, within 2 or 3 days, through Rose Kelly, the medium, just as Robert Graves had written The White Goddess in 3 weeks, which is one of the most profound books about paganism and pagan myth and ancient wisdom and magic, that still people don't know what it's about or how he managed to interpret it. He wrote the Book of the Law in 1904, and the Book of the Law was the basis of his Thelemic religion, which was adopted by a lot of the Fabians, a lot of the Hitler was very interested in the Book of the Law. All the Nazis were interested in it, certainly. And so he then went in the First World War. He was working for the Germans because they were deeply obsessed with his research and his ability to travel interdimensionally and summon up entities from other galaxies, or whatever you want to call them, dimensions, whether they be demons or aliens. So in 1918, he did what's called the Babylon Working in Montauk. Montauk is this village in Long Island off New York, and it was the latter stages of the First World War. He was also, incidentally, involved in the Titanic, which was, as everyone knows, was it wasn't even the Titanic. It was the Olympic. It was a ruse to kill all the people that wanted to go back to the gold standard. And the Federal Reserve in 1913, was all part of that. Established the fake money agenda. Which we're now going away from. He opened a portal in Montauk, and that was the portal that was then reopened by Frank Parsons, who was a jet rocket propulsion engineer, and Ron Hubbard, who ran Scientology. So in 1918, Crowley opened a portal at Montauk. Now, 30 years later, you know about the Montauk experiments, the Montauk boys? These were boys who were taken out, peasants.
Peter Moon wrote a lot about that.
Yeah, Peter Moon and the other guy.
And Duncan Cameron,
Duncan. Cameron was involved. Of course, Cameron was the man involved with Tavistock, and he worked for Tavistock. He also worked for, basically Tavistock and the CIA. They were swapping him. They were one and the same. So they worked. They got into competition later, but basically Huxley was very instrumental in certainly embedding the CIA and MK Ultra with the philosophical beliefs that came from the Fabians. Now, as regards to the military activity, Tavistock is military intelligence. Now, Crowley opened this portal, and it was to do with bringing in both those rituals he did in 1904 and 1918 were bringing in the Aeon of Horus. Now, I don't know if people know what I'm talking about when I talk about the Aeon of Horus, but again,
explain.
It's very essential to understanding the belief systems that developed United Nations, UNESCO, the World Economic Forum, basically the whole matrix, that the whole new order is based on this Thelemic belief system. So the Thelemic belief system is something that he wanted to, like, let's establish from the start that Crowley was a complete megalomaniac and probably a fantasist. But there's never been anyone with such a diverse range of magical talents as him. So the Aeon of Horus proceeded from the previous two eons. So like 2,000 years ago, we had the Aeon of Isis. Now, this also links into Graves' research, because at that time, before the advent of Christianity, the Aeon of Isis was when we were worshipping feminine gods. So Graves' idea about the fact that there was a time then which he can access, and which I've accessed, where you can access the female psyche by using a feminine goddess as a muse. Now, whether that be a physical manifestation of that person or an entity that Crowley would access. So Aiwass, the demon that he summoned in 1904, where are we going with this? Montauk. Yeah, Aeon of Horus. That was the Aeon of Isis. Now what followed that was the Aeon of Osiris. Now, Isis and Osiris were Egyptian gods and deities. Informs a lot of theological belief systems, including Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, the Knights Templars. They were all obsessed with these people, these deities. Osiris was the advent of Christ, and that was also the age of Pisces. So Osiris was the male principle. So we moved away from worshipping the female principle when was based on intuition, psychic powers, and a lot of that relates back to Atlantis belief systems, in the sense that Atlantis at that time was run along these lines where the psychic powers were more important than the material powers, and that we lived in a far more advanced society then, as was believed by the Germans and the Nazis with the Thula. So they were obsessed with Atlantis, always looking for lost Atlantis. When we moved from the age of Pisces, which is connected to Osiris, that's Christianity. So we had 2,000 years of Christianity, and that's when you've got the male god, i.e. Jehovah, and Christ represents Pisces, which is fishermen. So all his disciples, lots of his disciples were fishermen. The parable about fish, the loaves. And now we moved out into what is now called the age of Horus. So Isis and Osiris was the male-female principle, and Horus is the child of Isis and Osiris. And the occult belief system have adopted Horus. So the eye of Horus is when they close one eye. So the whole thing about Horus is that it is like, it's the age of Aquarius. Okay, so we've moved out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. Now, the age of Aquarius is not what people think it is. So the whole counterculture movement is based on, it's all love each other, and it's all mingling the races, and it's all flower power, and it's about finding you in a spiritual. That's all been perverted by the Freemasons, by the Illuminati, by various entities who might be not human. So the age of Aquarius is one massive hoax, and what it leads to is actually the destruction of mankind and the transformation of mankind into transhumanism. So the belief system about Horus is that Horus is where we're going into now. And Horus is represented or very connected to the transsexual androgynous god Baphomet, which is worshipped by the Knights Templars and also worshipped by a lot of other belief systems, especially integral part of Crowley's religion. So the age of Horus is what Crowley believed he brought in to play in his ritual in 1904. So the age of Horus is also connected to the Whore of Babylon. So when you look at Crowley's sex rituals, which involves, having sex when the woman's menstruating, a lot of stuff. We're now moving into that age, which is supposedly the age of Aquarius, but with the Luciferian belief system, everything's inverted. So the age of Aquarius is actually the age of destruction, and it's about bringing in this destruction. So without going too far into that, the age of Horus is the age of the 20th, which started with the 20th century, and the Twin Towers, the destruction of the Twin Towers. America has always been seen as Babylon and the whore of Babylon. So, the whole thing about Hollywood. And a lot of occultists and Fabians, also people like Blake and mystics, believe that America has to be destroyed, and that Crowley, by bringing in the age of Horus, or the Eon of Horus, which would last probably another 2,000 years, and that would be the transformation into non-human life forms. Now, either they've done deals with the people controlling this off planet or whatever.
Well,
but the fact
there
is,
are strong indications they've done deals with the Alpha Draconis.
Yeah, we're now in the age of Horus. I'm just trying to keep this on a practical level. So the Twin Towers in 2001 was the symbolic commencement of the age of Horus. That's when the terror started. Now, you get the Second Coming, you get Armageddon, you get End Times, all kind of religious beliefs. They all come into fruition now, including Albert Pike's, prophecies about the 3 world wars. So it's all been laid out in advance. The war with Russia, it's all part of the agenda. The Eon of Horus, Crowley's magic ritual, to put it very simply, was 1 + 1 = 2 or equals 0. So that's one of the simple formulas of Thelemic religion. So when you combine 1 and 1, it's about polarity, duality, and then synthesis. So the United Nations, all this stuff about one world government, one world currency, one system, one sex, and then one machine, is all part of the scientific agenda. So when the Twin Towers collapsed, 1 + 1 becomes 2, it also becomes ground zero. And how it's connected to sex magic is that when you have sex with another person, what the orgasm, what the French call a petit mort, the little death, that releases Kundalini, and the Twin Towers was one of the many symbolic gestures that releases, that signals the new Eon of Horus. And the Eon of Horus is one of destruction, and it's one of transformation, and it's one of Armageddon, and the end of the human to be replaced by the synthetic world, which is the Luciferian satanic world, which is a replica of God's world, if you want to put it that way. So when it happened, that you've seen the footage of George Bush Jr. At the time that the Twin Towers collapsed, 1 and 1. What?
The book was upside down.
Yes, that as well, which is also the Antichrist. But what's even more interesting is that he was reading. All these rituals are there to brainwash people. It's all black magic. Everything you see connected to these agendas involves a lot of black magic. So people are brainwashed. And when you understand the symbology and the numerology and the gematria that they use and the numbers, so I'll just say a little bit about the Twin Towers with regards to the Eon of Horus. And he was reading a book about a goat. Part of this belief system is worshipping Baphomet. Baphomet, the goat, represents the devil. It also represents Pan. So I've got a picture of Baphomet here. He was reading this story to children when it was announced to him.
We'll go to it. We'll just do that.
It was announced to him.
Just
Yeah, go on.
Want a glass of water?
Yeah, a glass of water. This is actually quite fundamental.
Do you want to take a little break there?
No, I'm okay. No, I think if I break, I might lose my track.
Yeah, okay.
As long as it's not, I'll try and be brief. But there's a lot of people that won't know about this because it's not something they've researched, you see.
It's in there somewhere near the end. There it is.
Baphomet, yeah, okay.
Okay, so I'll cut that up. Okay, Baphomet.
Right. Baphomet is the deity that represents synthesis. So you see on its the goat, the devil's horns, the pentagram on its head, the breast, the female body, the male body. One arm is a man's arm, one arm is a woman's arm. Solvi coagula, was the expression that was invented by Eliphas Levi, who was an early influence on Helena Blavatsky. Now, Blavatsky and Alice Bailey are massively important in terms of the New World Order, the United Nations. We can talk about them at another time. Baphomet worship is the worship of bringing both sides of the equation into one. So you solve the Hegelian dialectic by synthesis, and that synthesis leads to transhumanism, because what you do, you abolish the male-female principle, you combine light with dark, and you can, as above, so below. You see one's pointing up to the moon and one's pointing down, so you've got the black moon and the light moon, and that is also one of the elements of Freemasonry, that what is represented in the body is also represented in the universe, because the whole belief system of transhumanism is based on a lot of Fabian and Freemasonry doctrines about man needs to replace God, and in order to replace God you need to create a synthetic universe. So the Aeon of Horus is where we are now, and so yeah, all these wars, you know, America needs to be destroyed, and that's exactly what's taking place now in real time. You know, they're crashing the Western economy. This is all part of a pre-planned program. It's about taking down the Tower of Babylon. So, you know, they're on self-destruct. People think that Biden's just, I'm not going to go into Biden-Trump, but they're on course to fulfill their prophecy, whether that be a biblical prophecy or an occult prophecy. And it's all being instigated in real time, in the sense that the East, China, or whatever you would like to call the elites, the Illuminati, have already moved spiritually and financially over to the new system, which is a one world monetary system, which of course involved digital currency, the mark of the beast, etc., etc. So Crowley then opened a portal. This portal was later reopened by Jack Parsons. Was heavily involved with NASA, and as we know, NASA was pretty much run by all the people that were infiltrated from the Nazis, you know.
But Jack Parson, is that the JPL?
Yeah, JPL. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a brilliant rocket scientist.
Yeah.
He was also completely under the spell of Crowley, as was Huxley, as was Ron Hubbard, as was Timothy Leary, as was Kenneth Anger. You know, the leads back to Huxley are just phenomenal. So Jack Parsons was experimenting with all the stuff, and him and Ron Hubbard got together because they were both followers of the Thelemic religion. They also both practiced Crowley's sex magic. Now, a lot of these people got into Crowley's sex magic because if you're a sex addict, you know, it's great. It's a great excuse because, you know, these rituals did work. I've done a ritual myself, and I've got a child to show for it. So, you know, conceived with a ritual last year. So I know it works. In 1943, one of the belief systems around Zeno, which I haven't written about in my book, is that one of his sons, Amadeo, that Crowley opened a portal between the Menantol, which is one of the stones circles at Zeno, just near Zeno, which I've done a fertility ritual with somebody else, which went a bit wrong. But Crowley opened a ritual from there to Montauk, because as we discussed earlier, or we may later with ley line energies, there's a ley line or a grid line, electronic grid line, that goes from Menantol in Cornwall, Zena, to Montauk in Long Island, New York. And this portal that he opened in 1943, according to him, in the latter stage of his life, Hubbard and Jack Parsons were experimenting with all this new technology that the Nazis had probably got from via Aldebaran, or whether it's to do with the Antarctic bases and, you know, the Dracos and the Nordics who gave them all this technology, which relates again back to the Thule Society and H.G. Wells and Bulwer Lytton. They opened a portal in order to summon in what they would summon in would be the new Aeon of Horus. So it was about bringing in these entities that would bring about Babylon and the destruction. So that they did sex rituals where they got a prostitute, and they did the sex rituals with her in order to release the Kundalini, because they believed, along with Crowley, that performing these sex rituals would release this female energy that you could then bring in these entities. So all these kids were strapped in chairs in Montauk as well. That was the doing of Donald Cameron, and that was similar research to what I spoke about earlier about children especially poor children, when disappeared, like in Montauk, children were disappearing, because they always experiment on orphans and people who from backgrounds like me who suddenly you could disappear. So in Montauk, all these kids were going missing, and they were strapped into chairs, and they had mind control techniques put on them, so they'd be putting radio waves into their head. The Cameron was doing this with sleep deprivation. They were called the Montauk Boys, and it was Peter Moon, I think, and the other guy, I can't remember. Was it Cameron? No, Cameron did the research. There was another guy who wrote a book.
There was Al Bailich, Peter Moon wrote
exactly,
the books.
yeah, Bailich and all those. Yeah, I mean, very interesting. But this was all a Crowley ritual. So they tried to reopen this portal that in Montauk, and it went wrong. And then of course, all hell broke loose because an entity came in, and Crowley says that these two guys were idiots, and they were, because they didn't really understand Enochian magic, and they got the formula wrong. They opened a portal without closing it, and then they had to abandon the Montauk projects.
I think they called it Junior.
The what?
They called it Junior. It was walking about. You could see it.
Yeah,
black,
yeah, the entity.
And they had
yeah. But they were both those people. One Hubbard then went from Scientology, and of course Scientology, a very dark area connected to, Crowley, sex magic, the whole thing about adrenochrome and all that stuff. That's an extension of the use of hallucinogenic drugs. So the CIA were drawing on all the research that Huxley and Graves and other people had done over here, including Havelock Ellis, who also was based at Carbis Bay. This all came from the Fabian and the Tavistock research. It was all done here. All this research was done here. Now, also, the guy I was talking about earlier, Joe Lyon West, I think his name was, he passed all his information onto Porton Down, which was where the British biological experiments were taking place. And Porton Down was also, as you probably know, because it's very much your world, of these underground, DUMs and things like that. And biological research facilities.
You got the perception management, crop circles.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's not an area that I know very much about, but clearly it's all connected. So they opened a portal, and they couldn't close it. And Hubbard ran off with Jack Parsons' wife, ran off with his boat, ran off with all his money. It all went belly up. They had to close down the project. It's still there, I think. It just went underground. They had to release all these boys. It's connected to the Philadelphia experiment as well. Where that it's about.
And the Glock.
Yeah.
The Americans were doing the Philadelphia.
It went through time zones, timelines. So it's all about going through different timelines. And one of the guys, I think it was Al Bielik, might have been that. He jumped timelines because he went back into time before the experiment, and then his whole mind.
Al Bielik.
Yeah, or whether they're part of their MK Ultra brainwashing conditioning, you don't know. Because
do you think that's real? I mean, the movie and all that. 2 movies.
Well, given my own experience of jumping timelines, yeah, I don't think I've been brainwashed into thinking I'm in different timelines. But clearly, they can do that. They can create super spies. They can take a part of your brain and trigger you with going and assassinating John Lennon or whatever. Or going up and shooting up a shopping mall, and that's how they work. They work through Manchurian candidates. So, but the Eon of Horus is where we are now, and I think if people need to look a bit about what that actually means, and then they'll understand what we've got coming down the road, and how it's not happening by chance. It's all been predetermined, and everything that happens now is part of this program. Now, whether that's a construct or we're already in the satanic universe, which is we're already hooked up to the web or the Borg, or like Philip Dick, a very good writer, says, we are already living in parallel timelines. So, the timeline we're on is just the one we can't get off on. So when you go, you can slip into other timelines, and when you're in other realities with different people, and I've experienced that myself. So.
Well, we've been going for over 2 hours.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a break on that?
Yeah, take a break. I mean, the Crowley stuff is absolute dynamite. I'm not sure I can do all that.
We just keep going.
Well, maybe I'll do
another time.
I'll do Crowley next time, because it's absolutely, literally, you couldn't make it up. Let's put it that way. You know, you couldn't make it up. But I just know that he's very, very significant. And even if he is a con man and a black magician, the fact is, all the people that he's influenced and controlled believe in the rituals, and that's all you need to do. You know.
Well, this is part 2. We've started the pictures, and you've been working very hard. We'll take a break. Okay.
Yeah. I went off a bit there.